Hi, this is Jeff Helgeson in Heirloom Books at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois. And today I'll be attempting to very briefly overview what was probably the most productive 101 years in world literature. This was essentially the time between the death of Henry VIII in 1548 and the decapitation of King Charles I in 1649. What was created during this century or so includes, not necessarily in chronological order, all the works attributed to William Shakespeare, plus the Cavalier and metaphysical poets, along with Sir Philip Sidney, Edmund Spenser, Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Kidd, and Ben Jonson, with the King James Bible thrown in for good measure. Trying to talk about individual works from this time would probably take the next several months and still only provide the most superficial of treatments. But rather than simply giving things up entirely, what I thought I would try doing is sketching a general outline while offering a few personal observations along the way. To begin, in terms of historical context, in order for Henry VIII to divorce his deceased elder brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Spain's Ferdinand and Isabella, so that he could marry the younger lady-in-waiting Anne Boleyn in hope of conceiving a male heir for the English throne and thereby avoiding the kind of civil wars that had gone on for about 30 years, just a generation before, because the Pope would not sanction the dissolution of his marriage, Henry broke away from the Catholic Church and established himself as the Church of England, consequently bringing the Protestant Reformation to Britain and significantly changing the country's culture. Prior to this time, in addition to the entertainments provided by minstrels, jugglers, and various types of acrobats, the fronts of churches had frequently been used for performances of what have been termed miracle or morality plays, often performed by priests who could at least read, in addition to professional actors, presenting stories from the Bible and such allegorical works as The Summoning of Every Man, in which the central character is approached by death and unsuccessfully seeks to find someone to accompany him upon his pilgrimage into the afterlife, ultimately learning that only good deeds will venture with anyone beyond the grave. With the ascendance of Protestantism in England, however, due to a general iconoclastic attitude towards artistic endeavors of all types, ecclesiastical performances ceased taking place, and actors, although faring far better than many priests, almost 40 of whom were martyred in one way or another during the next few decades, like most of the visual artists throughout Northern Europe, became forced to adapt to the altered circumstances by seeking out new patrons and venues in which to perform. Among these were town squares, the interiors and courtyards of inns, the large residences owned by members of the aristocracy, many of whom developed private theaters and maintained their own companies of actors, such as those performing for Lord Leicester and the Lord Chamberlain's men. Also, universities like Cambridge and Oxford, which initially had presented Roman plays, began to produce new works dealing with English history. These schools then became associated with what were termed the Inns of Court, where performances took place. In 1576, James Burbage, one of the Earl of Leicester's men, and the father of Richard Burbage, the first actor to perform as Hamlet, Othello, Richard III, and King Lear, established a theater named The Theater just outside of London in the same general area as a pair of bull and bear baiting rings, apparently beyond the jurisdiction of the city's mayor, who it seems may have discouraged such enterprises. The theater was a round, unroofed structure, Shakespeare's wooden O from the prologue to Henry V, with a square stage that reached out into an area called the pit, where patrons, termed the groundlings, a little like Chicago Cubs bleacher bums, stood in any weather to watch the proceedings. Covered balconies provided seating for members of the upper classes, who also, for an appropriate fee, if they really wished to be right where the action was, could be seated on the stage. Back portion of the playing area then contained a small curtained interior space with a balcony extending above it. Also, in 1576, James Burbage opened a private enclosed theater called the Blackfriars that was within the city of London in a former Dominican monastery, which of course had been closed by Henry VIII along with all the other Catholic churches in England, and it became the home of a company of boys called the Children of the Revels. Quickly following the financial success of these initial enterprises, at least 9 other theaters opened, including the Rose, the Curtain, the Swan, and, in 1599, the Globe. Of course, so many new theaters required a steady stream of new plays, hundreds of which have since been lost to posterity, as well as the playwrights who could provide them. And these individuals quickly began to emerge. From the Inns of Court came a group of university wits, including Robert Greene, John Lilly, Thomas Kidd, George Peele, and Christopher Marlowe. Then, from the professional theater, there came George Chapman, Thomas Middleton, John Fletcher, Francis Beaumont, John Webster, Ben Jonson, and William Shakespeare. Among members of the aristocracy, for whom the romances of courtly love were strong influences, poetry for the page, rather than the stage, became increasingly popular. Sir Walter Raleigh, Edmund Spenser, and Sir Philip Sidney each contributed to the literature of the late 1500s. Raleigh even engaged in a kind of dialogue with Christopher Marlowe through his response to the lyric poem, The Passionate Shepherd to His Love, with the nymph's reply to the shepherd. Although somewhat insulated from the financial concerns of theater owners, playwrights, and working actors, however, the rise of Protestantism and its objection to such frivolous pursuits as poetry was nonetheless felt among the upper classes. For example, Sir Philip Sidney originally wrote his 360-some page The Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia as a pastoral romance of the old Arcadia for the entertainment of his sister. But then, after feeling compelled to write an apology for poetry in about 1580, he began to rewrite his earlier epic in the form of a much longer new Arcadia, following his revised aesthetic principles before being mortally wounded while fighting against Catholic Spain for the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I, leaving his reworked text as an unfinished cliffhanger at the time of his death. Speaking of the Virgin Queen, who came to the throne in 1558, Sir Walter Raleigh, in addition to naming an American colony for her and famously throwing down his cloak for Elizabeth to walk across without having to wade through the open sewer of a London street, encouraged Edmund Spenser to flatter the female monarch when writing in 1588, the year of the defeat of the Spanish Armada, what is, pound for pound, the longest poem in English literature, the Fairy Queen. Even though only half the originally conceived allegorical plan was ever completed, the effort apparently worked because Spenser was granted an annual pension of £100 by the dedicatee, the most high and magnificent empress renowned for piety and all gracious government. Back in the theatrical world, Christopher Marlowe, suspected atheist and homosexual, following success with Tamburlaine the Great while still enrolled at Cambridge, and then the tragical history of Dr. Faustus, telling the story of an aged scholar who sells his soul to the devil, the Jew of Malta, and Edward II in 1593, apparently managed to get himself killed during an altercation over a bar bill, clearing the way for a 29-year-old son of a small-town politician and one-time glove maker from Stratford-on-Avon named William Shakespeare to become the world's greatest poet and playwright. Though it's often been observed that not much is really known about this person, aside from the year of his birth in 1564, his marriage to a woman 8 years his senior, and the fathering of 3 children by 1585, just 7 years later, he had gained enough experience on the London stage to have progressed from player to playwright and be criticized in a pamphlet by Robert Greene as an upstart crow with a tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide. What is known about this ambitious upstart, as stated in Shakespeare, The Man by A.L. Rouse, is that by 1593 he'd written his history plays about Henry IV and Richard III, as well as Titus Andronicus, and then gained the patronage of the Catholic 19-year-old 3rd Earl of Southampton, an absolute necessity when that same year the theaters closed due to a plague which eventually killed about 20,000 people in and around London. While touring outside the city, Shakespeare also turned his attention to narrative poetry, with Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucretia, in addition to a sequence of sonnets initially designed to encourage Southampton, largely under the influence of the young pretty boy nobleman's mother, to marry and produce an heir, which then became the veiled chronicle of a romantic triangle involving the poet, his patron, and a mysterious dark lady who A.L. Rouse, at any rate, claims to have been the orphaned daughter of an Italian musician who had become the Lord Chamberlain's mistress until getting pregnant and then being married off to an apparently homosexual member of the household, then became involved with the playwright and later his patron. When faced with the choice between being the mistress of a young peer of the realm and a married, middle-aged itinerant writer with 3 children, however, she seems to have selected the former, leaving her poet admirer to have to both let her go and accommodate the reality of continuing to maintain a relationship with the man who paid the bills, at least until becoming able to make his own way without further financial assistance. Returning to London, the Comedy of Errors, Love's Labour's Lost, Romeo and Juliet, and A Midsummer Night's Dream were written. And then, following the death of his 11-year-old son named Hamnet back in Stratford-on-Avon in 1596, Shakespeare appears to have expressed himself in his play King John with the lines, "Grief fills the room of my absent child, lies in his bed, walks up and down with me." Then, in addition to being granted a coat of arms, the plays continued to be written. The Merchant of Venice, As You Like It, Much Ado About Nothing, Henry V, Julius Caesar, Twelfth Night, and in 1599, the year the Globe Theatre opened, just 2 years before the Earl of Southampton was sent to the Tower of London, the tragedy of Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark. Now, about this play, it seems everybody has a theory, even more than with the numerous speculations regarding the very authorship of all the plays, ranging from Christopher Marlowe having faked his own death and gone off to live and work in Italy, to Sir Francis Bacon, Sir Edward de Vere, and even somebody called Sir Henry Neville. Neurologist and psychoanalyst Ernest Jones, based upon a footnote in the work of Sigmund Freud, suggests an explanation of the play through the Oedipus complex. Sir Laurence Olivier described it as the tragedy of a man who could not make up his mind. James Joyce saw in the play a reversal of the circumstance regarding a deceased son, Hamnet, and his grieving father. And T.S. Eliot considered the play most certainly an artistic failure. So, being that Hamlet remains the most talked about enigma in literary history, I'm afraid I just can't resist the temptation of tossing in my 2 cents as well. You see, Hamlet, for me, is not about the honesty of the ghost, part played by Shakespeare himself, nor is it about the erotic relationship of the prince to his mother, or Hamlet's madness after seeing his father's ghost. Rather, I think first and foremost, it is a well-made play by an experienced actor and playwright who knew how to construct a compelling work for the stage. Beginning with the suspense caused by the appearance of the dead king's ghost, the play progressively alternates between active and thoughtful sequences, the centerpiece being a meta-theatrical play within a play, followed by a series of further dramatic events, ultimately leading to a total of 8 deaths and the transition of royal power before the rest is silence. For Shakespeare, of course, there was still the Merry Wives of Windsor, apparently at the request of Queen Elizabeth, who 2 years before her death in 1603 is said to have wanted to see the Fat Knight, the character of Falstaff, in love, Troilus and Cressida, All's Well That Ends Well, Measure for Measure, Othello, and King Lear in 1605, the year of Guy Fawkes' Catholic-inspired gunpowder plot that killed a newly crowned James I by blowing up the Parliament building while he was in it. This event was followed with the tragedy of Macbeth by the playwright's combined prophecy to the monarch of a long lineage of succession descending from his ancestor, Banquo, who, in spite of historical evidence to the contrary, is positively depicted within the play, and a direct lesson about the consequences of Machiavellian-style rule through fear before Antony and Cleopatra, Coriolanus, Timon of Athens, Pericles, Cymbeline, and A Winter's Tale, all in advance of Shakespeare's farewell to the theater with The Tempest and a financially secure retirement in Stratford, where he bought the biggest home in town and settled down, farming out sketches of other pieces for the likes of Beaumont and Fletcher to realize who with cannon fire in Henry VIII set the Globe's thatched roof ablaze, causing the theater to burn to the ground. Then, 4 years later, when his old playwright buddies came through town on a visit in 1616 and they all got together and got drunk at a local tavern by the river, the bard developed a fever and, according to Ben Jonson, became with his death not for an age but for all time. Within the next 3 or so decades, however, there was still to be Robert Herrick and his To the Virgins to Make Much of Time, most likely addressed to the Puritans awaiting their reward in heaven with Gather ye rosebuds while ye may, for you may forever tarry, in addition to Richard Lovelace writing to one lover on going to war in defense of king and country, I could not love thee, dear, so much, loved I not honor more, and then to another lover as a captive of the Puritans, stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bars a cage. Add in Andrew Marvell's appeal to his coy mistress and John Donne's progression from love poems to Do not ask for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee, and the religious Batter my heart, three-person God, with the early works of John Milton before Cromwell's 1649 execution of King James' son, Charles I, and you've got one heck of a literary 101 years. Next time, I'll be talking about Spain's contribution to world literature, Miguel Cervantes Don Quixote, the Man of La Mancha. My name's Jeff Helgeson, and Heirloom Books is located at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois, and it's open Tuesday through Sunday from noon until 7 o'clock in the evening.